Tell us a little bit about what your new book is about.
It's a biography of Bayard Rustin, who was, I describe him as like an agitator for justice. He was a really important figure in the American Civil Rights Movement, Black freedom struggle, also a pacifist who organized internationally against nuclear weapons, and somebody as well who really believed in economic justice as a necessity for social justice in the world.
I was talking with my mother is around your age. She protested for black civil rights in the late 60s and against the Vietnam War. And we were just talking the other day that she's shocked at some of the things that were seen in the news in 2012 and how she never thought that 40 years later we would still be dealing with this issue.
Yes.
What did you think? I mean, reading or learning and studying about the 60s, you are a history professor, history and gender,
yes,
and women's studies.
Yes.
Is that correct? At University of Illinois, Chicago?
Yes.
So what do you think about this sort of, some people call it a social regression that we're seeing these days?
Well, no, and it's, like how did a period like the 60s in which millions of Americans were campaigning for what we would call social and economic justice, how does it end up leading us into the most conservative period in American history? And part of why Rustin is interesting to me is because in the middle of the 60s, as it's reaching a crescendo of protest, he says, okay, we don't just want to be protesters. We want to become the system, but with our values and our worldview, not the system's worldview. And he speaks to his fellow radicals and says, like, how do we move from protest to politics? How do we work with the Johnson administration, who's given us civil rights legislation, but is also giving us Vietnam? You know, how do we do that, as opposed to just saying, Lyndon Johnson will never deal with him because he's giving us Vietnam. And the radicals of his generation and of that era just didn't, they were too committed to protest and the system is corrupt. Meanwhile, the conservatives said, yeah, we don't just want to protest, we want to run the country. And they decided to capture the Republican Party. You know, which so far from the 60s, people today probably forget that the Republican Party used to have lots of liberals in it.
Right.
Yes, you know, it was a coalition party.
Right.
And conservatives in the late 60s said, that's where we're going to go.
Right.
And so
like they're
Rustin,
the ones that took action.
Yes, Rustin had the right strategy. It's just that the wrong people did it.
Okay, so we have, there was a question about the Occupy movement. So we have that starting last fall. Many people in the Occupy movement in different cities. In Dayton, there's a small Occupy movement. A lot of them say that this isn't about politics and they don't want to take it that way. But you talk about protest is only part of the equation.
Yes.
So
yes.
What do you...
There are people who make the laws that we have to live by. And if the people who make the laws that the rest of us have to live by always see the world different from you in the Occupy movement, we're not going to like it.
Right.
So how do you both protest against, win people over to your way of thinking, and then be the ones who are elected to office, who organize communities, who make laws, it's very challenging. Because it forces those of us who have principles to have to make compromises. And people of principle don't like to make compromises. It's like selling out. It's hard, you know? So.
Well, what do you feel? This is my last question. I don't want to hold you. I really appreciate you taking the time out for us. How do you feel about these new laws that are kind of coming down against social protest and other First Amendment rights? It seems like the Occupy movement has it's scaring people and they want to protect the status quo and they're coming down pretty hard. You talk about we have to have peaceful dissent and peaceful protest. But it seems like there's a lot of energy that's simmering kind of underneath. And
And we're in, Rustin says from protest to politics, but he said it at a time when millions were protesting. Like, protest is a good thing. It's, the Occupy movement opened up a conversation that almost was not happening, and how to keep the conversation going. So, community organizing, public protest is totally vital. And then I also want to say, it's like everybody over the age of 18 needs to be registered to vote. And you can protest for 364 days a year, and on that one day, please make sure you vote. Please make sure you vote.
So we take that for granted
a
lot in this country. I thank you very much.
He has what I would call, we talk about political economy. He had a kind of moral economy. He believed that no act of violence can be self-contained, that every act of violence has consequences, and it stimulates emotions that will create more violence. So how do you fight for justice in a way that increases the sum of goodness in the world, really, rather than create more hatred and resentment and anger? By the 1950s, he's probably the most experienced Gandhian activist in America. And early in 1956, word starts trickling up to New York that the black people of Montgomery, Alabama are boycotting the city's buses. And it's not just one or two African Americans, it's the entire community that's doing it. And, Rustin thinks, oh my God, I've been waiting half a lifetime for an event like this to occur. And he goes down to Montgomery, Alabama. He meets the young boycott leaders, particularly Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., establishes a very close working relationship with Dr. King, and in a real sense, converts King and tutors King in nonviolence. Rustin ghostwrites King's first published piece about the boycott. He tells King, this is wonderful what you're doing here, but what are you going to do when it's over? This is about more than Montgomery. You need an organization that will have a strategy. Rustin writes the plans for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. King now has his organization, and Rustin thinks, how do we create a platform for Dr. King so that the nation hears him? And he begins organizing in the late 50s national demonstrations in Washington, not as big as what happens in the 60s, but the first demonstrations in which King is actually speaking to a national audience. King doesn't make an important decision in these years without consulting Bayard Rustin. At a key moment in the 60s, he wrote a manifesto called From Protest to Politics. Google it, look it up online. You can find the text of it pretty easily these days. And it was really one of the most profound and provocative things written in the 60s about how to make change. He says, we're no longer 5 people standing on Fifth Avenue with the sign. We're hundreds of thousands, we're millions of people. We don't just want to be protesters hoping that the people with power do what we want them to do. We want to become the people in the system who have the power to make these decisions. So it's sort of a bold and new way of proposing strategy for people who think of themselves as radicals, as leftists, as revolutionaries. While he's doing all of this great activist work, there's this second story occurring simultaneously. And it's not parallel to or separate from the activist story. It's really inseparable. It's completely intertwined. And it's a story of how a gay man who was remarkably open for this era, this is the era of the closet, how he navigates the homophobia and the gay oppression of that era. And this is a story of how homophobia and gay oppression creates constraints on what this agitator for justice can do, and how he has to figure out ways to maneuver against it. And really keep in mind now, okay, so we're talking about the 40s and 50s and early 60s. This is not the era of Ellen. It's not the era of Ricky Martin. It's not the era of RuPaul's Amazing Drag Race. It's not the era of 4,000 gay-straight alliances in American high schools. It's the era of sodomy laws in every state, of police having the utter freedom to walk into any gay bar they want to and arrest everybody there for being there. It's the era when psychiatrists could force the institutionalization of gay men and lesbians against their will because they were mentally ill. It's the era when the FBI regularly did surveillance of gay people.
Based on your study of Bayard Rustin, what do you think hurt him back more? Is race or is sexual orientation?
Well, it's actually hard to kind of separate those things out. What I would say is that for his generation, actually, race was going to hold him back much, much more than sexual orientation, because race was visible. There was the history of racial exclusion. You couldn't avoid it anywhere you went. Wherever Rustin went, when he was walking on the streets of New York, he was a black man, and he wouldn't accept restrictions on himself, so he didn't just live his life out in Harlem. So race, he was confronted by race every day of his life, but he was also of a generation where he could get support for his racial identity and make his racial identity a core of how he resisted. So really, race never stopped getting in the way, but race also empowered him in a way that his sexuality didn't empower him. You know, if he were a generation later, if he were of this generation, he could have gotten the same support for his sexual identity that he found within movements for his racial identity. What do I think I learned from this immersion in Rustin's life about social change, about oppression, about struggles for social justice? I want to mention 4 things. Not necessarily in the order of importance, but sort of 4 lessons. One is that the impact of homophobia and gay oppression on the shape of American history has been profound, but it's not easy to calculate what the cost has been. I interviewed a lot of people for the book on Rustin, and when I interviewed the people who knew him in the 40s, when he was this Gandhian activist, still a relatively young man who didn't have a high profile, in the course of almost every interview I did with these older pacifists, they said something like this: we thought he would be the American Gandhi. So just like, take that in for a minute. That's like saying you think this man is going to be one of the 4 or 5 most important people in world history in the 20th century. You know, that was the impression that Rustin created. That was the power that he had, that he exerted for people around him. Well, he doesn't become the American Gandhi. We all don't know who Bayard Rustin is, okay? We'll multiply this by all the other gay and lesbian stories from the past about lives that couldn't get fully lived because of homophobia and gay oppression, and we begin to get a sense of what the cost of homophobia and gay oppression was. The second lesson is that even with this, even with what he had to go through, Rustin himself is a much more important figure, I think, than most historians credit him. He is, I would argue this till doomsday, he is more responsible than anyone for really bringing Gandhian nonviolence to the US. He was vital in the evolution and development and growth of Dr. King. He created linkages between issues and movements. For those of you who kind of study feminist theory, he was arguing in effect for intersectionality, but without identity and before we talked about identity. His person and his beliefs just brought movements together. Rustin is really, really important, and yet we don't know who he is. So, like, maybe there's a lesson here that really ordinary people who we don't know, you know, like you all, can actually be incredibly important people in history. You know, Rustin did not grow up as a big deal kid. He was just an ordinary kid in Westchester, Pennsylvania, but he made it to, even though we don't know him, he changed the course of world history. So one lesson of Rustin's life should be, I can make history too. The third lesson is that his choices and his decisions, I think, suggest lessons that he would offer to activists for social change. I mean, he really did believe that nonviolence was the only way to make change that doesn't produce more hatred and more antagonism and more violence. Not you just sit back and take it. It's an active nonviolence, but nonviolence. Rustin cared for his whole life about issues of war and peace, and we're living in the middle of wars right now. But he eventually came to the conclusion, as a pacifist, that if you want peace in the world, you don't do it by campaigning against war. You get to peace by campaigning for justice. That only by eliminating the inequalities and the injustices in the world do you beat away at the things that make countries and make peoples go to war. He also believed that, and this I think is in some ways his most challenging lessons, that movements grounded in identity, movements based on nationalism or ethnic solidarity or gender or sexuality, in the long run, were only going to preserve the differences and divisions that lead to oppression. You know, he believed that identity might make you more aware of oppression and injustice, but that ultimately we had to take up the issues that we frame today often as identity issues because they were right, not because they were who I am and I need to fight back. And he also thought that protest, and he was a great protester, protest was a means, not an end. It was a tactic, not a strategy. He believed in coalitions, but not in coalitions of interest groups, like let's work together, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, but what he called a coalition of conscience. You know, again, we do this because we're united by a moral vision of the universe. Last lesson, the last thing I want to say, is that I think, at least for me, in a time that as a teacher of American history, I would describe as the most conservative era in American history since the Gilded Age in the 19th century. Rustin's life and career has something to tell us about hope. Okay? You know, we're living in a time when national leaders tell us that the surest route to safety and security and freedom and justice is by fighting wars. We're living in a time when the gap between the rich and the rest is greater than it's ever been, when our national government seems to exist often only to serve the wealthy, and when almost every bit of good that government has done in the last century is being systematically undone. in circumstances like this, where do you find hope? You know, where do you get the energy to fight in the way that Rustin fought? Well, Rustin had great staying power. He came of age in the 30s when masses were protesting, and then there was the Cold War and McCarthyism, and he was standing there alone. He lived through the 40s and 50s, and then the 60s came around, and it's like, oh my God, masses of us are in the street again. And then those movements failed, and he died during the Reagan presidency. He watched the world turn, you could say. And it was crushing for him in certain ways, but he never gave up, he never threw in the towel, and he never went home to tend his own garden. And in the last years of his life, during the 1980s, he was interviewed quite a lot by younger activists who would go to the old man, you know, what can you tell us? You know, teach us some lessons. You know, what keeps you going? And what Rustin said, and this is actually a quote from him, is that the conclusion he had come to in the course of a long life was that the gods did not require us to succeed in our endeavors. They simply required that we not stop trying. And he would say to these younger activists, hope is not something that you go looking for. It's not something you're going to kind of find out there. Hope is something that you and I create every day by the actions that we take in the world. And that, to me, is an incredibly hopeful and empowering lesson. It means that it really does leave it up to us, not to those powers that be somewhere else. So with that, I think I will stop. And